Today, our democracy faces an existential crisis. An insurrectionist is running for the highest office in the land, one who routinely threatens his opponents and free press with vengeance. Adding to the challenge, a Supreme Court with a right-wing majority will decide whether this insurrectionist can pursue the nation's highest office. Yet, many Americans deliberately or inadvertently continue to downplay that danger, embracing a deeply naive belief that autocracy could never happen here, that the threat is overblown and American democracy could never collapse or be subverted. There's no need to look abroad to Germany in the 1930s or to Hungary today to understand the consequences of normalizing extremists. We need only to look to our own history. American democracy has succumbed to tyranny in the past. You see, the North won the Civil War, but for nearly a century after, democracy itself was lost in America's South. White supremacists, defeated in war, furiously resisted equality for black Americans, and over time, Jim Crow became the law of the land. The Supreme Court actively participated in this assault on liberty that was won in a civil war in which 700,000 Americans died by legalizing racial segregation throughout the South. Unspeakable tragedies were inflicted on generations of non-whites, leaving behind dark legacies that echo loudly into the present. Recognizing this uncomfortable truth is crucial to understanding the gravity of the current threat, because the stakes today are on a national scale. Today's circumstances mirror the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the basis for the lawsuits challenging Donald Trump's eligibility to run for office again, was crafted in the aftermath of the Civil War as a democratic safeguard. It specifically excluded from office those who broke their oath to support the Constitution in 1868. That meant those who sided with the Confederacy in the Civil War. Those who urge us to overlook Trump's actions on January 6th for the sake of unity echo the exact sentiments of that era. In 1972, a general amnesty allowed former Confederates to run for office again. So what happens when an enemy of democracy becomes the chief executive of the United States? Well, after the 14th and 15th Amendments granted rights to the formerly enslaved, multiracial democracies emerged in the South, forming electoral majorities during the period known as Reconstruction. But opponents of racial equality refused to accept those election results. Confederate General Wade Hampton, backed by white supremacist groups, contested election results in South Carolina's gubernatorial race through fraud and violence and eventually seized power. The Confederates under Hampton then initiated a government restructuring campaign to entrench their power, similar to what Trump and his allies have vowed to do once back in office. These Confederates succeeded in solidifying their grip on power across the South by disenfranchising black voters. The Supreme Court during this period relied on originalist interpretations of the Constitution to justify decisions that protected this powerful minority, much like what today's conservative court is doing. But so-called originalism provides a convenient off-ramp for Supreme Court justices who attribute their rulings to a cherry-picked past. In reality, constitutional expert Kermit Roosevelt III writes, justices are not simply enforcing the views of the long-dead framers, they are deciding which views to enforce. We have a tradition of pursuing justice at the expense of unity, and a tradition of doing the opposite. America contradicts itself. To paraphrase Whitman, it contains multitudes, and the argument that this is not who we are is most often a statement of aspiration for the future rather than a statement of fact about the past. In the end, we are responsible for who we become and for what becomes of our country. We should not pretend that history relieves us of that burden and that honor. The loss of democracy in the South was regional, but today the entire nation is at stake. And once again, the court is being called on to safeguard democracy. And irrespective of what it decides, this will be a political decision with long-lasting political consequences. I want to welcome Kermit Roosevelt III to the show. He's a professor of constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the author of the book, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story. Professor Roosevelt, thank you for being with us. I've been looking forward to having you on the show for a long time. There is considerable debate among legal scholars about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and its disqualification or potential disqualification of Donald Trump. Originalist readings of the text present arguments on both sides, but you challenge the legitimacy of the debate itself, stressing that judges are actively making choices. Talk to me about what happens when justices on the Supreme Court assert that they're merely trying to follow the framers' intent.
Well, so I think the main thing that originalism is doing now is it's sort of working as a rhetorical strategy that lets the justices deny responsibility for choices that they're making. So, the American people have strong views about the right of children to attend school safely versus the right to bear arms. And that's a trade-off that people might think, we should do some studies and figure out how we can balance these rights. But originalism, the justices say, takes that away from us because the choice was made in the past. And as judges, they're just following the law. They're enforcing the choices made by we the people and put in the Constitution. And the problem is history is complex. Constitutional provisions written hundreds of years ago without specific facts and circumstances of today in mind actually don't answer those questions. So the justices can look back at the historical record and they pick a side and then they pretend that's the only answer.
And then this is further complicated by the arguments some have made in this particular case about the 14th Amendment. Some argue that it's a stretch to compare January 6th rioters and what Donald Trump there did to insurrectionists who triggered the Civil War. Some argue that January 6th pales in comparison with the devastation unleashed by the Civil War and they shouldn't be compared. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that really misunderstands what happened on January 6th. So you didn't have hundreds of thousands of Americans killed, certainly, that's true. But that was not a protest. That was not people out there saying, we don't like what the government's doing, we wish it would act differently. That was people saying, we're going to force the government to do what we want, and we will kill you if you stand in our way, right? We will hang Mike Pence. And what they were trying to do, what they wanted the government to do, was illegally keep Donald Trump in power. So they're trying to take over the presidency. They're trying to take over the position of commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army, right? If that doesn't scare you, then nothing should.
Some people also make the argument that barring a leading contender from the ballot is somehow undemocratic and instead calls for defeating Donald Trump at the box office. The box office. This is what this has become. It sounds like a box office. The ballot box for the sake of unity and stability. Now, in your book, you note that putting unity ahead of justice is the sin that echoes through our America. Tell me what that means.
Well, so putting unity ahead of justice, and by that I basically mean unity among white Americans, is what America does frequently. And we say, we have to do this to move forward. We have to get the colonies together to fight the British. We have to get everyone to sign on to the Constitution. And in order to do that, we make compromises. We sacrifice other values. Most consistently, what we sacrifice is racial equality. So that's why you get the constitutional provisions that preserve and protect slavery. And that's why at the end of Reconstruction, you get white America turning its back on this ideal of racial equality. Because what brings whites together is racial hierarchy. It's white supremacy.
You've actually made this point that the Civil War didn't end the racial hierarchy in this country. And in fact, it persisted for another 100 years. You are an expert on the Reconstruction era and the subsequent redemption movement, which was a campaign by white supremacists to restore their power and to actually reverse civil and voting rights gains. And you have described January 6th and the post-January 6th insurrection as being part of a similar kind of redemption. You're sort of making the argument that there was a civil war, there was Reconstruction and the redemption, and we're sort of there again. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so you see this pattern in American history, that there are movements for equality. Americans believe in equality. That's one of the strands of our history. And equality movements make progress. Sometimes it comes through conflict and tragedy and great cost, which is the Civil War. And then there's a backlash, and that's redemption. So the Reconstruction governments are overthrown by military force. The U.S. Army doesn't interfere. Voting rights are taken away. The integrated schools are dismantled. A lot of the gains are undone. And then, you have to wait. And in that case, you wait almost 100 years. But the equality movement rises again. It's the second Reconstruction, the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, the Warren Court, all of that. There's a backlash. Again, it's the new federalism. It's the Reagan Revolution. This is when originalism becomes popular as a constitutional theory of interpretation. And what we're seeing now, I think, is the same thing, sort of in microcosm. So we had the Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd protests. Everyone was talking about a racial reckoning. People's attitudes are changing. And we made some progress in terms of equality. What we're seeing now is a backlash. The attack on DEI is part of that. The ouster of Claudine Gay is part of that. And January 6th, and the argument that, elections are only legitimate, or we only respect electoral results if we win, that's sort of the Trump view. That's exactly what the redemptionists were saying.
Kermit Roosevelt III, this is a crucial and important argument that you make, and you've written it, and it was written before we were in the situation that we're in right now. So we really appreciate that. I truly hope maybe we can sneak some of the copies of your book to the Supreme Court so everybody realizes what their actual responsibility is in the coming days and weeks. We are honored to have you on the show. Thank you for being with us. Kermit Roosevelt III is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, the author of the book, The Nation That Never Was, which is uniquely relevant to the moment in which we exist right now.
Feel any better? I have already put evac on alert. He's ready to go if it comes to that. General, I can assure you.
Hey, General, let me into the war room to see you, so I had to hack my way onto this frequency.
This better be critical, Wheelie.
Sir, come on, when is it not, please? Okay, couple of things. I'm running low on the dough. I was thinking about taking a couple of months sick leave, maybe starting today. And, oh yeah. I intercepted a transmission from Megatron.
Then send it through.
Yes, sir, right away, sir. And so I'll assume that we're good on the other stuff.
This is your last warning, insects. Relinquish what remains of the Allspark.
So who's the insect? You? What? Who's the insect?
Protect you. They were defeated on our world, and we will defeat them here.
The Megatron.
This was just a diversion. Security, please bring him up. Rabbit, she's already inside. Deeds! Give me an update on that reserve. Boss readiness. What was his name? What was it?
Evac, sir.
Right, evac.
She's right in front.
We're facing a heavy sustained attack. They appear to be after the Allspark. General,